In the winter of 1842, something happened at a Kentucky plantation that doctors couldn't explain and authorities desperately tried to hide. A family dying slowly from mysterious illnesses. A seamstress named Patience, who never made mistakes. And clothes that killed from the inside out. If stories about Patience, the virtue and the woman, matter to you, then stay with me. Because what Patience did in Kentucky tells you everything you need to know about revenge, served cold, one stitch at a time. Belmont Estate sat in the bluegrass country of central Kentucky, 2,600 acres of tobacco and hemp, worked by 89 enslaved people under the ownership of the Morrison family. The Morrisons were old money, had owned the land since before Kentucky became a state, considered themselves aristocracy in a country that pretended not to have such things. The current master was Nathaniel Morrison, 41 years old, married to Constance, father to 3 children ranging from 7 to 15. He ran Belmont with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from never questioning your right to own human beings. Among the 89 people he owned, Patience was considered one of the most valuable. Patience was 34 years old in 1842. She'd been born on Belmont, the daughter of a woman named Ruth, who'd been the plantation's head cook. Patience had learned sewing from her mother and from an elderly seamstress who'd trained her from age 6. By the time she was a teenager, Patience was the finest seamstress in the county. She could make dresses that looked like they'd come from Paris, suits that fit perfectly, linens so fine they felt like silk against the skin. White families from neighboring plantations would request Patience's services, paying the Morrisons for the privilege of having her work on their clothes. Nathaniel Morrison considered Patience an excellent investment. She'd probably cost him $800 when he inherited her at age 12, and she'd more than paid for herself through her work. He treated her relatively well, gave her better quarters than field slaves, adequate food, occasional fabric scraps for her own use. But Patience was still enslaved, still property, still someone whose entire life was controlled by people who decided her labor belonged to them. And Patience had her own reasons to hate the Morrison family. Her mother, Ruth, had died 3 years earlier, under circumstances that were officially ruled an accident, but that Patience knew were anything but. Ruth had supposedly fallen down the kitchen house stairs and broken her neck. But Patience had seen the bruises on her mother's arms before the fall, had heard her crying the night before, had witnessed the argument between Ruth and Constance Morrison about burned biscuits. Patience believed, knew in her bones, that Constance had pushed her mother down those stairs, but no one would ever investigate. A white mistress killing a slave cook. Even if witnesses came forward, which they wouldn't, no court would care. So Ruth was buried in the slave cemetery, and Constance continued living her comfortable life, and Patience swallowed her rage and kept sewing. For 3 years she endured, sewed dresses for the woman who'd killed her mother, hemmed pants for the man who owned her, made christening gowns for children who would grow up to own human beings just like their parents did. And all the while, Patience was thinking. She was smart, smarter than the Morrisons realized. They saw her as a skilled laborer, valuable property, but they never imagined the calculations happening behind her eyes. Never considered that someone who spent hours alone with needle and thread and fabric might have time to contemplate complex problems. Problems like, how do you punish people who can't be touched by law? How do you hurt someone when any open act of violence would result in your immediate execution? How do you make masters understand what they've done when they don't see enslaved people as fully human? The answer came to Patience slowly, over months of thinking and observing and learning. Belmont Estate had an extensive herb garden maintained by an elderly enslaved woman named Aunt Judith, who knew plants the way Patience knew fabric. Judith grew medicinal herbs, feverfew for headaches, chamomile for digestion, willow bark for pain. She also grew other plants that white people didn't pay much attention to because they assumed Judith only cultivated useful things. But Patience had spent time with Judith, learning about plants, asking questions that seemed innocent but were actually very specific. Which plants were poisonous? Which ones caused rashes? Which could be absorbed through skin contact? Which symptoms would doctors recognize versus which might be attributed to natural illness? Judith answered these questions because she thought Patience was interested in avoiding accidental poisoning or in treating various ailments. She never suspected Patience was gathering information for a very different purpose. By the fall of 1841, Patience had a plan, not fully formed yet, but taking shape. She understood which plants could be processed into substances that, when incorporated into fabric, would cause illness through prolonged skin contact. She knew which symptoms would appear gradually enough to avoid suspicion of poisoning. She understood that the best revenge was slow, that quick deaths raised questions, while prolonged suffering could be blamed on natural causes. But she needed to be careful, needed to be patient, in both senses of the word. The opportunity began in October 1841, when Constance Morrison announced that the entire family needed new winter wardrobes. This was normal. Wealthy families regularly updated their clothing, and Patience was expected to create everything from undergarments to formal wear. Patience began with Constance's undergarments and nightgowns, items that would be in constant contact with skin for hours at a time. She told Constance she was using a new treatment to make the fabric softer, more comfortable. In reality, she was carefully incorporating poison sumac oil into the finishing process. Poison sumac causes severe allergic reactions in most people: rashes, itching, sometimes systemic symptoms if exposure is prolonged. But the reaction doesn't appear immediately. It can take days, and if the exposure is low level and constant, the symptoms might be attributed to other causes. Patience was extremely careful in her preparation. She wore gloves when handling the treated fabric. She worked alone in the sewing room, making sure no one else would be accidentally exposed. She incorporated the sumac oil into the fabric's finishing rinse in concentrations that were low enough to avoid immediate obvious reaction, but high enough to cause cumulative problems. For Constance's garments, she focused on areas that would have the most skin contact: the bodices of dresses, the waistbands of petticoats, the collars of nightgowns. Any place where fabric would rest against skin for hours, warming up with body heat and allowing the poison to be absorbed gradually. She delivered the new undergarments and nightgowns in late October. Constance was delighted. The fabric was indeed remarkably soft, just as Patience had promised. She began wearing the new items immediately. Within a week, Constance developed a rash. She complained to her doctor, who attributed it to dry winter air and recommended a soothing lotion. The lotion helped temporarily, but the rash returned because Constance kept wearing the treated clothing. Over the following weeks, her symptoms worsened. The rash spread. She developed headaches, fatigue, digestive problems. The doctor was baffled. He couldn't identify any obvious cause for her declining health. Patients watched all of this with careful attention. The sumac was working, but slowly, exactly as planned. Constance was suffering, but not dying. Not yet. And no one suspected the new clothing, because who would imagine that fabric could be poisonous? Emboldened by her success with Constance, Patience expanded her campaign. For Nathaniel Morrison, she used a different approach. Men's clothing was typically less delicate than women's, so she needed different methods. She focused on his shirts and undershirts, particularly the collars and cuffs, areas that would be in constant contact with neck and wrists, where skin was sensitive and absorption would be good. But instead of poison sumac, which men were less likely to be sensitive to, Patience used something else she'd learned from Aunt Judith, a tincture derived from poisonous plants found in the woods beyond the plantation: Jimson weed, foxglove, white snake root. All highly toxic if ingested, but also capable of being absorbed through skin in small amounts, with cumulative effects. She processed these plants carefully, extracting their essences, diluting them to levels that wouldn't cause immediate crisis, but would build up in the body over time. Then she worked these substances into the sizing she used for Nathaniel's shirts, the stiff treatment that kept collar and cuffs properly shaped. Nathaniel received his new shirts in November and immediately began wearing them. He prided himself on being well-dressed, on maintaining the appearance appropriate to his station. Within 2 weeks, he was experiencing symptoms: confusion, irritability more intense than his usual baseline cruelty, tremors in his hands, vision problems, digestive distress. The doctor, the same one treating Constance, was now attending to 2 family members with mysterious progressive illnesses. He began to suspect some environmental cause, perhaps bad water, contaminated food, an infection passing through the household. But he never suspected the clothes they wore. Patience listened to all the speculation, attended family consultations in her quiet, invisible way. Enslaved people were often present for white family discussions because whites didn't consider their presence worth noting, and learned what symptoms to expect, what doctors were thinking, what suspicions to avoid. For the Morrison children, Patience was more restrained. They hadn't killed her mother. They were young, still forming their characters. She didn't want to kill children. Her quarrel was with Nathaniel, and especially with Constance. But she did want them to suffer somewhat, to understand that actions have consequences, to associate their family's ownership of human beings with their own discomfort. So for 15-year-old Margaret, 12-year-old James, and 7-year-old Emily, Patience created garments treated with much milder irritants, substances that would cause itching, rashes, sleepless nights. Uncomfortable, but not dangerous. The children developed symptoms throughout November and December. They scratched constantly, complained of feeling unwell, became irritable and difficult to manage. The doctor was now treating 5 family members for unexplained illnesses that presented with overlapping but distinct symptoms. He consulted with colleagues in Louisville and Lexington, searching medical literature for any disease that matched this presentation. No one suggested checking the family's clothing. By January 1842, the Morrison family was in crisis. Constance was bedridden, her rash covering most of her body, her strength fading. Nathaniel was experiencing seizures and hallucinations, the cumulative effects of the plant toxins patients had incorporated into his shirts. The children were miserable with constant itching and fatigue. Neighbors visited and were horrified by the family's deterioration. Theories circulated about curses, about divine punishment, about some plague that had descended on Belmont Estate. Patience continued her work quietly. She cared for the family's clothing, washed and mended their garments, taking care to avoid exposure herself, and created new items when requested, each one carefully treated with her special finishes. She also made sure to create new items for herself and for other enslaved people on the plantation that were completely untreated, so there would be no comparison that might raise suspicions. She told the other house slaves that the family was experiencing some illness, that they should be careful about close contact, that it might be contagious. This actually helped her plan, because it provided an explanation for why the enslaved people weren't getting sick while the Morrison family was falling apart. In February, the doctor finally suggested that perhaps something in the house itself was causing the problems. He recommended the family temporarily relocate to a different building on the plantation, while their main residence was cleaned and aired out. This created a problem for Patience. If the family wore different clothing, items she hadn't treated, their symptoms might improve, which could eventually lead to someone suspecting the original garments were the problem. So Patience volunteered to pack the family's clothing for the move, making sure they took the treated items with them. She also suggested to Constance that perhaps the family should have entirely new wardrobes, that maybe their current clothing had somehow been contaminated by whatever was making them sick. Constance, desperate for any solution, agreed immediately. She commissioned Patience to create a completely new wardrobe for every family member, with instructions to destroy all their current clothing. This was perfect for Patience's purposes. She could create a new set of treated garments while getting rid of evidence of her earlier work. But it was also risky. Creating so many new items meant more opportunities for something to go wrong, for someone to notice something unusual about her process, for the pattern to become too obvious to ignore. Patience decided to be strategic. She would continue treating Nathaniel and Constance's clothing aggressively. They were her primary targets, the ones she most wanted to punish. But she would ease up on the children, let them start recovering. This would make the illnesses look less universal, less like a single environmental cause. She spent March creating the new wardrobes, worked long hours in the sewing room, handling treated fabric with extreme care, making sure every stitch was perfect, because perfection was her disguise. No one suspected a seamstress who did flawless work. The new clothing was delivered in early April. The family began wearing the fresh garments, and the pattern continued. Nathaniel and Constance's conditions didn't improve. If anything, they worsened. But the children began to feel better, their symptoms gradually fading. This created a new narrative. Something was affecting the adults, but not the children. Maybe it was a disease that only struck people over a certain age. The doctor latched onto this theory, searched for illnesses with age-specific presentation. By May, Constance Morrison was dying. The cumulative effects of months of poison sumac exposure had destroyed her health. Her skin was covered in suppurating wounds. Her kidneys were failing. She couldn't keep food down. She was in constant pain. Patients sat by her bedside sometimes, ostensibly to adjust her nightgown or help change her linens. Constance would look at her with fevered eyes and sometimes whisper, "Thank you for Patience's care." Patience would nod and smooth the poisoned fabric of Constance's nightgown and think about her mother at the bottom of those stairs. Constance Morrison died on May 18, 1842. The official cause of death was listed as wasting sickness of unknown origin. She was 40 years old. Patience helped prepare her body for burial, dressed her in a beautiful gown, untreated because there was no point poisoning a corpse, and arranged her hair and made her look peaceful. At the funeral, people commented on how devoted Patience must have been to care so faithfully for her dying mistress. What dedication, what loyalty, what a credit to the Morrison family's benevolent ownership. Patience stood in the back during the service, her face appropriately sorrowful, and felt a cold satisfaction that would have horrified anyone who could see inside her mind. One down, one to go. After Constance's death, Nathaniel's health continued to decline. He was experiencing seizures several times a day now. His mind was deteriorating. He'd have conversations with people who weren't there, forget where he was, become violently angry for no apparent reason. The doctor diagnosed him with some form of brain fever, recommended rest, quiet, limited stimulation. The family hired nurses to care for him around the clock. Patients continued to provide his clothing. His nurses would ask for fresh shirts, clean nightclothes. She'd deliver them promptly, beautifully laundered, perfectly pressed, thoroughly poisoned. Nathaniel Morrison died on July 3, 1842, less than 2 months after his wife. The doctor listed the cause of death as seizure disorder and mental degradation of unknown etiology. He was 41 years old, leaving 3 now orphaned children who would be raised by relatives. At Nathaniel's funeral, the community mourned the tragedy of such a prominent family being struck down by mysterious illness. Some whispered about curses. Others suggested the family had offended God somehow. A few wondered if there might be something poisonous on the plantation itself. Bad water, toxic mold, contaminated grain. An investigation was launched. Inspectors examined the main house, the water supply, the food stores. They tested everything they could think of. Found nothing unusual. No one tested the clothing. The Morrison children were sent to live with an uncle in Lexington. Before they left, Patience made sure they had complete new wardrobes, untreated this time. Her quarrel had been with Nathaniel and Constance. The children were orphans now, which was punishment enough. The plantation was put into trust until the children came of age. A manager was hired to run operations. Patience continued her work as seamstress, now sewing for the manager's family and for neighbors who still requested her services. She was considered the finest seamstress in the region. People praised her work constantly. Never made a mistake, they said. Every stitch perfect, every garment flawless. Patience continued this work for another 23 years, until the end of the Civil War freed her in 1865. She was 57 years old then, her eyes failing from decades of close work, her hands gnarled with arthritis. After emancipation, Patience moved to Louisville. She opened a small dressmaking shop, built a modest business, trained several young black women in the craft of fine sewing. She never married, never had children, lived quietly, and died in 1889 at age 81. She never told anyone what she'd done, never confessed, never hinted, never gave any indication that Constance and Nathaniel Morrison's deaths were anything but tragic natural causes. But she never forgot either. On the anniversaries of her mother's death, Patience would visit her grave. She'd bought a proper headstone after the war, and she'd sit there for hours. And sometimes she'd smile in a way that would have disturbed anyone who saw it. The story might have stayed buried forever, if not for an accident of history. In 1923, 81 years after the Morrisons' deaths, a historian researching Kentucky slavery was going through documents at the county courthouse. He found death certificates, estate records, bills of sale, and he found something odd: receipts from the Morrison estate showing unusual purchases in the months before Constance and Nathaniel died. Large quantities of fabric treating supplies, orders for specific plants known to be poisonous, all charged to the household account, with notations indicating they were for the seamstress's use in treating fabrics. The historian dug deeper, found medical records describing the Morrisons' symptoms, consulted with a toxicologist who confirmed that the symptom patterns were consistent with chronic poisoning from skin contact with certain plant-derived substances. Then he found Patience's story, traced her life from birth to death, discovered that her mother had died under suspicious circumstances shortly before Patience began ordering those unusual supplies. Put the pieces together. He wrote a scholarly article about his findings, published in an obscure academic journal. Did a Kentucky seamstress murder her owners? Evidence of poisoning by textile treatment in the Morrison family deaths of 1842. The article made no firm accusations, couldn't, given the evidence was circumstantial, and everyone involved had been dead for decades. But it laid out the timeline, the suspicious orders, the symptom patterns, the motive. It concluded that while the deaths had been ruled natural at the time, there was substantial evidence to suggest deliberate poisoning, most likely by someone with access to the family's clothing. That article languished in academic obscurity for decades. Then, in the 1990s, historians studying resistance during slavery rediscovered it. They saw in Patience's story, if it was true, an example of sophisticated, patient, strategic resistance. Not the dramatic rebellion of a Nat Turner or John Brown, but something quieter and perhaps more effective. Murder disguised as natural death. Revenge served so cold, it took over 80 years before anyone even suspected. Descendants of enslaved people from Belmont Estate were interviewed. A few elderly people still remembered family stories about Patience. One woman, whose grandmother had known Patience, shared a story that had been passed down. Grandma said that Patience told her once, years after the war, that the best revenge is the kind that no one ever sees coming. She said patience, both the virtue and her name, was her greatest weapon. She said she'd learned from sewing that if you want to change something fundamentally, you don't tear it apart. You work slowly, carefully, one stitch at a time, until the whole structure transforms. When asked if Patience had ever explicitly admitted to killing the Morrisons, The woman shook her head. Grandma said patients would never confirm or deny anything, just smiled in this particular way, and said that sometimes clothes make the man, and sometimes they unmake him. That's as close as anyone ever got to a confession. Today, historians debate whether patients actually murdered the Morrisons, or whether the correlation between her purchases and their deaths is coincidental. The evidence is circumstantial. The motive is clear. But motive isn't proof. The technical knowledge to accomplish such a thing existed, but that doesn't mean it was used. What's not debatable is that 2 cruel slave owners died under mysterious circumstances, and the woman they enslaved, who had training in textiles and access to poisonous plants and a powerful motive, benefited from their deaths in the sense that she no longer had to serve the woman who'd killed her mother. The photograph we have, or rather the image representing Patience in her sewing room, surrounded by the tools of her trade, captures something essential about her story. A woman in a domestic space that looks innocent, but was actually a workshop where she plotted and executed what might have been the perfect crime. Because if Patience did poison the Morrisons, she got away with it completely. Not only was she never suspected, she was praised for her faithful service to the family. People felt sorry for her when Constance and Nathaniel died, saw her as a victim of their deaths rather than the cause. That's sophisticated resistance. That's intelligence and patience, the virtue, combined with rage and determination to create something that looked like tragedy, but might have been justice. And the brilliance of it, if it was murder, was that no one could ever prove it. The evidence was all destroyed. The treated clothing burned after the deaths, the plants harvested and used, left no trace. The method was so subtle that even when the symptom patterns were analyzed decades later, the most that could be said was consistent with, rather than proved by. Patience understood something crucial, that in a system where enslaved people had no legal recourse, no protection, no power, the only way to fight back was through methods that couldn't be detected or traced. Poisoning through textile treatment was brilliant because it exploited exactly the blind spot that slaveholders had. They thought enslaved people were too simple, too unsophisticated to plan complex crimes. They never imagined that someone sewing their clothes might be sewing their deaths at the same time. And even if suspicions had been raised, how do you prove that fabric was deliberately poisoned? How do you distinguish between unfortunate natural illness and deliberate murder when the method is so subtle and the evidence disappears with normal laundering and wear? You can't. That's the genius of it. So was Patience a murderer? If the historian's theory is correct, yes. She systematically poisoned 2 people over the course of several months, causing them prolonged suffering before they died. Was it justified? She'd witnessed her mother's murder and had no legal recourse. She was enslaved by the people responsible. She had no way to seek justice through official channels because enslaved people couldn't testify against white people and wouldn't be believed even if they could. Does that make murder acceptable? That's a question each person has to answer for themselves. What it definitely makes is understandable. If you live in a system where you have no rights, no protection, no recourse, and you watch your mother be murdered with no consequences for the killer, at some point the question becomes not, should I seek revenge? But how can I seek revenge in a way that might actually work? Patience, if she did it, found a way. Used her skills as a seamstress, her knowledge of plants, her understanding of how her master's minds worked, and her willingness to be patient, both the virtue and the name, to execute what might have been the perfect crime. She was never caught, never even suspected during her lifetime, lived to see emancipation, built a free life, died of natural causes at a reasonable age. If she was guilty, she got away with it completely. And the Morrisons died slowly, painfully, confused about what was happening to them, unable to stop it. If that was Patience's revenge, it was comprehensive. So what do you think? Did Patience poison the Morrisons, or is the evidence just an unfortunate coincidence? If she did it, was it murder or justice? Should she be condemned or celebrated? These aren't abstract questions. They're about how we understand resistance in oppressive systems, about what we owe to victims who have no legal recourse, about where the line is between justified revenge and unforgivable crime. If you believe these stories matter, the subtle ones, the ones where resistance looked like compliance and murder looked like tragedy, then remember Patience. Remember that she was a skilled seamstress who made beautiful clothing. Remember that her mother was murdered by her mistress with no consequences. Remember that she had access to poisonous plants and the knowledge to process them. Remember that her owners died mysteriously shortly after she began treating their fabric with unusual substances. Remember all of it: the skill, the motive, the suspicious timing, the perfect execution, the complete lack of detection. That's the full picture. That's the truth that might be truth, or might be elaborate coincidence, because we'll never know for certain. That's what makes Patience's story so compelling. It's a mystery that can't be definitively solved. The evidence suggests but doesn't prove. The motive explains but doesn't confirm. The timeline supports but doesn't establish. All we can say for certain is that a woman named Patience was enslaved by people who killed her mother, that she was an expert seamstress with knowledge of poisonous plants, that her owners died under circumstances consistent with chronic poisoning through textile treatment, and that she lived long enough to see freedom, and never once admitted to anything. Make of that what you will, but make sure you remember her name: Patience. Both the virtue that allowed her to wait for the right opportunity and execute a plan that took months to bear fruit, and the woman who might have proven that sometimes the most devastating resistance is the kind no one ever sees coming. The seamstress who sewed more than fabric, who stitched poison into every garment, who killed with thread and needle and plants from the garden, who transformed her sewing room into a murder chamber that looked like any domestic workspace. If that's what she did, it was brilliant. Horrifying, but brilliant. Remember her. Remember that resistance doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like perfect service, flawless stitching, beautiful garments that kill from the inside out. That's Patience's legacy. That's the story that needs telling. Whether it's true, or just a theory that fits the facts too well to be coincidence. The slave who might have sewed poison into the clothes of the Big House family. Kentucky, 1842. A mystery that history can suggest but never prove. A revenge that was either perfectly executed or perfectly imagined by historians looking for patterns in tragedy. Either way, It's a story worth remembering, because it shows that intelligence and skill and patience, both virtue and name, can be weapons as effective as any blade or bullet. Remember patience. And next time you put on clothes someone else made, think about trust. Think about how vulnerable we are to the people who have access to the things that touch our bodies every day. Think about a seamstress in Kentucky who might have understood that vulnerability and used it to devastating effect. That's the story. That's the truth that might not be truth. That's what happened, or might have happened, when a woman named Patience decided that some deaths are worth the patience required to make them look natural. Remember her name.